joined today by Mr. Oliver Laurence, and it really excites me to have Oliver talking with us today. He's going to give you some real examples of what being a big-time PI is. I know he doesn't like to be called that, but you know, he has gone international. Oliver's a former police officer in a couple of states in Australia. He's currently in London. He's returned to the homeland. And he owns OJT Investigations, a very successful firm. He's also been a border force officer as well. Got a whole range of wide range of skills, and really grateful, Oliver, you could join us today. Have a bit of a yarn to us about life as a private investigator, and we had a bit of a chat off camera about what that sometimes means to people. What do you tell people when people say, "What do you do?"
It's a great question. As I said off camera, I hate this kind of stereotypical image of a private investigator, because I think we are so much more than that. You, I, and other people in the industry come from really professional backgrounds, having had law enforcement careers over a number of years, and then deciding to move into the private sector to give ourselves an understanding as to what is in the big wider world. Yeah. No particular day I do is the same. I think that's the primary reason for me enjoying what I do, because it very much replicates what I used to do. Policing provided me with a very diverse career where no 2 days were the same. The investigative industry, in terms of the private sector, is very much the same. Today, I could be asked to try and find someone globally, or I could be asked to do some asset tracing globally, or I could be asked to carry out a large investigation in terms of trying to save an individual's life who may be in custody, facing a very, very bleak outlook if we're not successful. So for me, it's the diversity. It's also the people, it's the clients. They are incredibly demanding at times, but that's what makes you perform at your highest level. It's that thrill of being successful, and ultimately, if you do well, financially rewarding.
Mm. Great. Now, you, of course, you come from a policing background, and I think some of the points I've made and others have made is that you don't need to have been a law enforcement officer to be a good PI. I'm sure you'd agree with that. Tell us a bit about your journey to being an investigator, corporate investigator.
Yeah, sure. So I actually grew up here in the UK. I was born here, but I emigrated with my family in 2002 to Australia. I decided I always wanted to be a police officer. So in 2004-05, I moved to South Australia, where I commenced my policing career. Excuse me, travelled around the state, various different locations, and then always promised my family that I would get back to Queensland as soon as I possibly could. 2009, I transferred up to the QPS, Queensland Police Service, where I spent the remainder of my career until 2016. 2017, travelling around the state. I left at the rank of a sergeant. I was always operational as a police officer. So I was always doing general duties, supervising large teams, a bit of public order, you name it, I kind of touched on it. I was never a homicide or detective. I didn't have a detective qualification. I was just very good. I consider myself to be a very good operational police officer. So those investigational skills and base blocks for what I was eventually going to do have certainly aided me. In 2016-17, I decided to leave the police for my own personal reasons. I'd have seen enough. I think we all have that point where we decide to move on and draw the curtains. I then decided to take up a very short stint position with the RSPCA as an investigator, which was an interesting side of investigational work. It was ultimately policing, but without the powers, and dealing with the same type of clientele. So it was an interesting insight as to not having that power of arrest anymore, but ultimately having to investigate things and using probably the most important skill I'd learned during my policing career, which was the ability to communicate with various different cohorts and understand how I could get them to do stuff by talking with them. So that was probably fundamentally the most important thing I took away from that. After that short stint, excuse me, I actually took up a position working for the Australian Border Force and Wilson Security combined as a professional standards investigator in the Australian federal government's offshore processing centres of Nauru and Manus Island. So my job during that period was to investigate complaints made by asylum seekers and refugees, as to the conduct of the service providers that were charged with looking after them within the facilities. I did that role for a number of months before I was promoted as to security manager, where I took over one of the facilities as the oversight of the safety and security of the individuals that we're looking after. So that was an incredibly interesting insight into that process. Obviously, it's been a bit of a political hot potato for various political parties that have led the Australian federal government. But ultimately, it's an incredibly successful operation, which ultimately does look to look after and did meet the needs expectations of the people they were processing through those centres. So that was an interesting period of investigational work. It was during that period that I set up OJT Investigations Group. I saw a flavour of private work when I was doing, it was a fly-in, fly-out role. So when I was flying back into Brisbane for my R&R, I had 2 to 3 weeks of downtime to allow me to kind of explore where I could go. And I remember being given my first private investigation job, which was a slip and fall at a Woolworths supermarket, which is quite an interesting case. So yeah, so that's been my kind of progress up until most recently when I moved back to the UK. I had a couple of large jobs in Australia, which kind of put me on the world map. And ultimately an offer was made to me, which was too good to turn down. I've returned home, where I now represent a larger company as well as my own, which has been absorbed in terms of my investigational work here in the centre of London.
Right, yeah. Tell us a bit about what your day looks like as a PI.
I think there's two sides to this, ultimately. One side of it is very much the marketing side of me in terms of getting my messaging out there, meeting people, getting them to understand the capabilities of an investigator in the private sector or security risk management consultant. But there's other parts of my day which would be very much investigational work, whether it be looking for an individual who could be located any part of the globe. I get inquiries to find people globally. So I could be liaising with other investigators in the US, in the Middle East, Asia, parts of Ireland, you name it. Russia is another key one. So yeah, so it could be a mix of both investigational work, but also to make sure that investigational work comes in, quite a bit of marketing in terms of meeting with people and demonstrating what we've been able to achieve in the past and where we could add value, especially lawyers. Lawyers is obviously a key target of most investigational firms. Obviously showing them how we could value add to some of their cases, which they ultimately advocate and fight for their clients in court about. That could be family matters, criminal defence matters, civil matters. There's quite a variety.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and I think people going into this industry don't quite understand the breadth of work that some investigators can do. Of course, you can specialise, but you mentioned there something called criminal defence, and that is actually quite a big area in terms of investigation. Can you explain what that, what that sort of work involves, and as a good segue into, I know you've got a good story. I only read it in the Courier Mail not too long ago about a very, very major job, international job you did. Maybe tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I think the first important thing is, I think all of us that have come from those policing backgrounds, one of the first things we're told is that the policing is so diverse. You can do so many different things, from being a SOCO, firearms, you can be a community policeman. There's so many different roles. And that couldn't be more, it could be true within the private sector in terms of investigational work. At the moment, as we speak, I'm working for an ultra high net worth client who bought a large country estate and was very overwhelmed by the people around him. He felt like the prey, being surrounded by people trying to take his money so ultimately they could have a piece of the pie and help him in this big project. So I find myself at the moment parachuted into that lifestyle to support him and be his right-hand man in terms of vetting the people that come near him, understanding the process, implementing the staff. Safety and security is a key one, CCTV infrastructure and the like. So various different roles. But criminal defence, as you mentioned, is a key area of where we can value add in terms of cases and supporting the legal fraternity. criminal defence, for me, leading into my big case, has always been supporting lawyers and trying to find information which will support them in terms of providing a defence for their client. In Australia, I've represented people that have been convicted, seeking an appeal to try and either have that sentence reduced or to have a retrial, from homicide offenders to attempted homicide. The most recent one, which you talk about, which made obviously globally in the papers, without going into too much detail, was an individual in Sydney who travelled to Singapore. He was heading for another island. He was intercepted in Singapore and was found to have in his possession 90 grams of cocaine with a very, very high level of purity. He was immediately arrested and taken off to Changi Jail, quite an interesting environment in itself, and was placed in the queue for a trial which would lead ultimately to a conviction, which would ultimately lead, sadly, to being placed on death row. Because the threshold in terms of the quantity of illicit substances you can have on you in Singapore is incredibly low, and ultimately the punishments are very, very severe because they take it very, very seriously, and they like to obviously demonstrate a significant deterrent to anyone thinking about engaging in that behaviour. So very quickly, I was engaged by the family in New South Wales. They had heard about me. I was recommended to them in terms of some of my work that I'd done previously. That matter was probably one of the greatest thrills of my life, but also one of the matters which kept me awake most nights, because ultimately failure was not an option. And this family had already had their investigation turned down by 2 other providers, I think on the basis that they were very concerned if they had failed, what are the ramifications for that? I felt personally that whatever happened, we could only try and help. So ultimately jumped on board, put together a couple of colleagues of mine locally who supported me as well in terms of making some very, very important decisions. But I spent a lot of time in Singapore investigating that matter on the ground. And to cut a long story short, after 367 days in custody, we were able to demonstrate they had the wrong person. And along with a fantastic prosecution team, or defense team, barrister, we were able to demonstrate quite clearly that there were holes in their brief of evidence the size you could drive a truck through. So that for me was probably demonstrated to me that the sky is the limit for private investigators. If you have the drive, the determination, and you want to go and find that sort of work, it's out there. We're not just the guys and girls who sit in a bush with a camera taking opportunistic photos of a couple that may be having, concern with their marriage. It is a far bigger industry than what is often described as, and what you see in adverts. There are, but it's not to say you can't do those roles. No. But for those of us that probably want a little bit more, they're out there.
Yeah, and you're right, and there's equal call for people who do surveillance and get their private investigator's license. Good segue again into another job which I'd like you to tell me about, which involved another international thing, investigation in Hong Kong, which involves a lot of surveillance. Tell us a bit about that one.
Yeah, sure, and this leads on the point of very well of surveillance agents and being a quality surveillance agent, because often people like myself who like to manage these jobs and bring it all together rely really quite a bit on good, competent surveillance agents who can A, turn up on time, B, capture the images you need to capture, remain calm under pressure, etc., etc. But the particular job you talk about was a Hong Kong-based investigation supporting another ultra-high net worth client who found himself in what I describe a bit of a pickle. Some intellectual property got into the hands of an individual or a group of people who, after doing some creative Googling, realized how much the individual was worth and ultimately started to blackmail him. That was a very lengthy investigation. It went for 5 months. I had upwards of 6 investigators working for me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, round the clock, watching sometimes upwards of 4 or 5 targets. whilst we were doing our background work, due diligence, vetting, understanding who these individuals were, where they fitted in the big picture of this investigation. Yeah. And what we were trying to achieve is we were putting together a brief of evidence for an extortion on an international scale, which we could present to the Queensland Police Service to say, this offence has been going on. This is the evidence to support it. You know, images of them setting up offshore bank accounts. We had a hostage negotiator working on behalf of the client from New York. So this was very much a significant global effort. It was a global team effort, and we were incredibly successful. But that sort of investigation where you have a number of resources working for you, I suppose you can start to understand the gravity and the scale and the pressure of some of the jobs. But, you know, that's a good place to be. It's great professionally. It's great. There's no point being around the bush. It's good financially because ultimately that's in the private sector we still need to earn. Yeah. I think it's a real thrill because we handled that matter so well that we were able to do what I described as a private intervention, where we advise the police that we're going to speak to the individual. It's not in our interest to go to court. It's not in the offender's interest to go to court. We have a conversation, sign some legal documents, and the matter was over within about half an hour, 45 minutes. But to get to that point, to cross all our T's and dot all our I's, took some effort.
Yeah, look, they're two fascinating stories, and thanks for sharing those with us. If I'm a young investigator, or not young, sorry, if I'm any investigator who's just got my license, one of the main questions I would ask was, Oliver, how would I get work? Who do I approach? Who do I look to mentor me? How do I go about getting work? Because as you know, it's all this business is subcontract, and I often get asked, how much am I going to earn, which is a funny question to answer. But what are your views about that?
Yeah, the earning question's probably a really challenging one to answer because I think, like any industry, there's peaks and there's troughs, and there are very, very busy periods. There may be quieter periods, but in terms of sourcing the work, which is often what you've got to in the early stages, is reach out to all the large providers. I probably jumped a little bit too fast. It depends what you want to do. I'm of the view that in the early part of your career, in terms of private investigation, I don't think you can be very fussy in terms of just getting experience, getting behind the camera or getting behind the notebook, hitting the ground running. That you're reaching out to some of the bigger companies. I do receive probably in a 12-month period, probably about 20 or 30 emails a year from people that are doing their certificate 3, or they're doing their, or they're going into their diplomas of government investigations and want exposure. It's always a great idea to send an email, attach a resume, attach your CV, so that we can see the skill set, so we can see how we can utilize you ultimately. And there may be a requirement that you just want to be a surveillance operative. You don't want to be a factual investigator and go and ask those questions about, a TA, a traffic accident, etc. But I very much started my career in the private sector serving documents, which is what I did when I first joined the police. One of the first things you do is learn how to serve a summons. And I'd almost gone back to that to kind of build those blocks again to understand kind of what was available in the private sector. So I went from serving documents to lawyers, to doing some factual work, to then doing some surveillance work at a matrimonial, kind of investigative level, where we've got the allegations of cohabiting with others. So I did a bit of all of that. And then I thought to myself, I'm doing all this subcontracting. I think I can do this myself. I think I can find this work. And there are those of us that will be entrepreneurial and want to pursue that dream of having our own brand. Yeah. And it was from that OJT was born. But that's my tip is Google is your friend. Have a look at those page 1, page 2 investigational agencies, write to them, have a conversation, and understand if there's opportunities that exist. And I can assure you there will be, because there will always be an opportunity for surveillance agents. There will always be an opportunity for factual investigators, especially in the insurance industry, where claims can be challenged from time to time in terms of people kind of ballooning out their claims. So there's an opportunity. You've just got to find your niche and what you enjoy doing.
Yeah. What do you think, Oliver, are the main traits that you need to have to make a good investigator?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was asked this very recently, and I had to give it some thought, although I should know the answer off the top of my head. So patience is the first one. I think you need to be patient. You need to have attention to detail. Be prepared not to accept everything on face value, because ultimately it's about challenging the questions, looking for the errors, understanding the bigger picture, and not having tunnel vision. Patience, detail. I think resilience as well. Resilience is a good one, because things won't always work out the way that you thought they would work out. And it's not a bad thing. It's a learning experience. And so resilience from policing days has helped me in terms of some days, jobs, the two jobs I've talked about are very successful jobs. But don't get me wrong, there's been jobs which haven't gone well. Yeah. And, you can have that where you thought you were onto something, but it's just fallen away and it hasn't eventuated. So just resilience and not kicking yourself when those things go wrong. Yeah. So, and I think a drive to be successful, to be hungry for the work, to be able to go look for it. And I think the ability to communicate well as well is an important one for me across a number of different groups of people. One particular, especially here in London, on certain days I could be talking to a Queen's Counsel, a top counsel who's always in the media, and the next day I could be talking to the witness of a traffic accident or somebody that I need to serve a document on, so you really have to kind of modify your language to be able to communicate effectively with those people. So communication is also another important one for me. They're some of the traits that I think are important.
Yeah, good. That's great advice. Like any job, I suppose, there are downfalls. What are the downfalls of being an investigator, particularly, I guess, a subcontractor?
The downfalls. I suppose as a subcontractor, there's always the unknown as when's the next job going to come along? When's the phone call next going to be for me to work? When am I next going to be needed? That's probably an important one for people not to be too worried about, but just to bear it in mind. For me, sometimes it's the time away from home. When I was doing insurance investigations in Australia, I did a lot of travel around Queensland. I worked predominantly in the outback when I was in the police in a lot of Indigenous communities, and I kind of was hoping that my time was over with that. But ultimately, the work presented itself, and I was working in Longreach, Charleville, Mount Isa, some of those very remote country towns where there is still a need for investigators. So I was, I travel, being away from home, time in Singapore. I spend time in the US now. Being away from family's never pleasant, but it's part of what I do now. And probably, I'm not a big one for failing. I don't like failing at things. So when an investigation doesn't go well, or we don't get the answers we think we can get, I sometimes give myself way too much harder. I reflect on where we could have done better. It's managing expectations of clients is the biggest aspect of this, because we aren't, there's often this preconceived thought that we can grab any information from any database. I spend most of my time explaining to clients that we very much are members of the public when it comes to powers, that ultimately what we are is very good researchers. We know where to find the answers. We know how to write reports. So, and that's often why you get the work, because it's just all too overwhelming for clients. But it's managing expectations is a hard one, because you're constantly trying to tell clients that's not possible, or that's illegal, or that international child recovery is too dangerous. Managing expectations is a really hard one.
Yeah. Look, lastly, I suppose, Oliver, one piece of advice you'd give to anybody wanting to become a PI. Sometimes, that decision can be made on emotion, I guess. They've watched a bit too much Magnum PI or something like that. We all know it's not like that, much like police shows. The reality is very different. Someone who really wants to make a go of this and do some investigation, whether it be workplace, whether it be surveillance, whether it be insurance work, whatever, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
My one piece of advice, and I was given this piece of advice probably about 2 or 3 years before I left by former Chief Superintendent Steve Hollands, and he's now a barrister in Brisbane. And he said, never stop learning.
Right.
Never stop learning about you in your arena, your skills. And I never stop learning. I'm always reading. I always want to know what's going on in the industry. I want to know where the technological advancements are that can make me a better investigator. For instance, I spent 3 weeks in the US last year learning about the Celebrite technology, phone forensics, an area that really interests me. And I want to learn about it because I think it's a niche area that I can support people in recovering deleted data, understanding phones and technology and WhatsApp and Signal, because there's some of the, there's some vulnerabilities in some of that software that clients will come unstuck. So I think my advice is never stop learning and never give up and just keep pushing.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, Oliver. It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your stories with us. I wish you all the best there in the UK. Hope things get better soon.